Everyone, welcome back to live. For those of us who are live after we went through our blizzard, and thank you again to Yoni for facilitating the Zoom. A little bit of introduction as we approach the Parshas of the Mishkan. People, by saying that I usually mean me, have a really hard time when we shift into these Parshas, because we've gone from Parshas that dealt with exciting stories, Mitzrayim, Yetzias Mitzrayim, Matan Torah. Mishpatim was harder for sure, but it's halachas that apply to us day in, day out. And now we're about to hit parsha after parsha after parsha of what seems to be Lego, right? It's great details. There's nothing else that takes up so much ink, a single topic that has so much ink in the Torah as the Mishkan. We go through the commands to build it, we go through the materials, we go through the clothing for the Kohen Gadol. The Sefer finishes with the Parshas of Vayakil and Pekudei, summing it up and telling us how they put it together. And what bothers us sometimes is, number one, we don't have it anymore. Right? So what am I supposed to do? And number two, even if we did have it, what am I supposed to get from all this detail? So, first of all, the Sfas Emes, I think, brings down this principle. He says, from Shamayim, from above, they only give and never take back. If the Mishkan was given to us, it still exists, and it still has its power, and all the mitzvahs connected to it still exist as well. They take different forms. When we have the Mishkan, we have the Beis HaMikdash, and even now, when we have none of them, there's the concept, people know the famous song, Bilvavi Mishkan Evne, based on the writings of the Baal Sefer Charedim. There's an internal Mishkan that we're supposed to build. We're supposed to learn from every aspect of the Mishkan and construct our internal Mishkan. The Mishkan itself was a physical manifestation of spiritual things. Okay, that is the construction of the Mishkan, in essence, is spiritual engineering. The beauty of the Mishkan was that it came in a physical way that we could touch and walk into and be part of. But the real content of it, the living Mishkan and Beis HaMikdash, was something spiritual. We find this in the Chazal that says when Titus was going back after having destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, he was feeling pretty proud of himself. And a Baskol came out and said, Rasha, right, wicked one, Kamcha techina katochant. You have ground flour that was already ground. Bayit sorv sarafta. You burnt a house that was already burnt. What does that mean? Titus put the torch to it, right? Putting aside Josephus' defenses of Titus, but he burnt it. What does it mean it was already burnt? The Nefesh HaChaim explains that Titus has no ability to destroy a Beis HaMikdash, just as he has no ability to build a Beis HaMikdash. Only Am Yisrael can build the Beis HaMikdash, and that is done, as we see in the very beginning here, with Terumah Me'es Kol Nediv Lev, right? The idea of the giving of the heart. The description in Shir HaShirim, Tocho Ratzuf Ahava, is paved with love. Am Yisrael had the spiritual powers and connections to create a Mishkan. When they were no longer worthy to have a Beis HaMikdash, it was destroyed. What Titus did was build a shell. The Talmud Rebbe explained a fascinating Gemara with this. The Gemara brings down that Rabbi Yochanan, not the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was there at the time of the Churban, but a later Amora Rabbi Yochanan, said, in the timeline of the Churban, so they set fire to the Beis HaMikdash at the end of Tisha B'Av, and it burnt into the 10th. That's why we still have some mourning customs that continue on partway into the 10th. He says, if I had been there, I would have made the fast day on the 10th of Av, because that's when the building was really burning. So the Rebbe asked, was he criticizing the Chachamim before him, that they got the day wrong, that they put it wrong? He said, no, he was actually criticizing himself and praising their wisdom. He said, if I had been there, I probably would have been focused on the fact that the building was burning and viewed that as the Churban. They drew our attention to the fact that the Churban happened before the building burnt. Okay, that was the way it happened. And that's the construction, or lo aleinu, destruction of a Mishkan, of a Beis HaMikdash. There are many Mefarshim that go into the secrets of each piece of the Mishkan. Every measurement, every amount, every material is specific, means something, transmits something. And we should remember that these items that we describe here were hidden. They were nignaz. Okay? Those original ones were not destroyed. They were not taken any place where Indiana Jones can find them. Right? You see the descriptions that are there, that they were really nignaz bimkomo. I saw the parish. That means that they're still there. They're just inaccessible. They're unseen. But the power is there. The Shem says when we light our neros on Hanukkah, the menorah lights up wherever it is. Our shulchan is, so to speak, a receiver of the transmission of that shulchan itself. It has an interesting application custom. I saw one sefer once that brought down and said the custom is to have a shulchan with 4 legs, because that was the way the shulchan is, and our shulchan parallels the shulchan in the Mishkan. That actually was applicable to me once. Once some friends of mine moved out of a place and they were getting rid of their furniture, and they had this kind of modern table that was sitting on 2 semicircles, right? So my wife hated the table from the get-go, but then when I saw that thing about the 4 legs, that helped me get rid of it and get into sync with her on that. Okay, so these things are here, these things are connected. We're going to try to focus, as we do, on one small detail and see how it opens up an entire world for us. We'll start with the Shem MiShmuel. Medrash Rabbah, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Lo haya ha'olam roi lishtamesh ba'arozim. Okay, now, the Mishkan, the main part of the building, was built out of boards. They're described as atzei shitim, but these are also parallel to what's called arozim, usually translated as cedar. Now, the Medrash goes into the story behind these boards, that actually Yaakov Avinu brought them to Egypt, right, in preparation. And when Am Yisrael left, they brought those with them to build it. Now here Rabbi Chanina says, the world really shouldn't have had the right to use such wood. They were created for the Mishkan and for the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, meaning this was something, this very precious thing that came into the world. Nobody should be using it for their living room furniture, for these kind of things. It came into the world for this purpose. Now, the Shem MiShmuel says, wait a second. It's not such a fancy wood. Right? It's a rather common wood. Where it grows, it's out there. He says, why shouldn't you use it so much? So he says, this is what it's saying. An erez represents something, that type of tree. Chazal tell us, the famous Gemara in Maseches Tainis, La'olam yehei adam rach kekoneh va'al yehi kasher ke'erez. A reed represents flexibility. We are meant to be flexible. Right? Now it's fascinating that Chazal tell us that the reed has some surprising strength, because all the winds in the world can blow on a reed, and it's true, the reed gets knocked over by the wind, but then the reed always comes back. Its flexibility is the source of its ability to survive so much adversity. The erez represents inflexibility, strength of standing there, not flexing with things, not changing, not moving. It is what it is. Our instruction is, be a reed, don't be an erez. So now this is what it's saying. Why should such a midah, such an attribute of inflexibility come into the world? It's only meant to be used in the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash. Where does it apply? What does it do? Now, the Gemara in Maseches Yuma says a fascinating thing about these boards, the krashim of the Beis HaMikdash. It tells us they're described as atzei shitim omdim. Atzei shitim that are standing, an ongoing present tense. Atzei shitim that are standing. Now, on one hand, right, they are supposed to be placed, when you're building something out of boards, you have 2 options. If you're thinking of building a wooden fence, let's say, you can have the boards standing up, or you can have them lying horizontally, one on top of the other. Here, this makes it clear to us, derech gedei lasan, just like the tree grows vertically, so too construct it with the boards standing vertically. But then it says, Davar acher omdim, another explanation of omdim, Shema tomar avad sivran v'batel sikuyan. Perhaps you will say that their hope is lost and that our outlook for them will never happen. Let's read Rashi's explanation of this to make it clearer. He says, Shema tomar, says Rashi, maybe you'll say mishenignezu, when they were hidden. Okay, these boards have gone into hiding someplace. Avad sivran, there is no hope for them. Shelo yashuvu od, they'll never return. Batel sikuyan, the word sikuyan is a fascinating word. The samach kof type of word has to do with seeing. Okay, Yiska was another name of Sar Imenu. One of the explanations was Shesocha b'Ruach HaKodesh, that she would see with Ruach HaKodesh. In Hasidic Svarim, you find that they connect the sukkah to that as well, that the sukkah enables us to see things differently. So Rashi says, Batel sikuyon masha'anu sochin v'tzofin lahem. What we are looking for and anticipating for those boards, you might think it's never going to happen. They were nignaz, they were put away. It tells us, Atze shitim omdim, she'omdim la'olam u'lo'olamim. They stand forever. It's beautiful, it's moving, but what does it mean? Right? They're still put away someplace. They're standing, they still stand. Explains the Shem MiShmuel. He says, those standing boards are a poel dimyoni. They represent something. You have to realize what that physical manifestation is showing us. La'oz v'yischazku shel Yisrael ba'avoda. To the strength of Am Yisrael, to the constant self-strengthening that Am Yisrael are able to do and must do to serve Hashem, to fight against what? Yush. Right? The baddest, worst word you can say to a Breslover, right? Yush. Despair. Right? They should not despair. The Raglei Shiflut Matzavam Begashmius Uveruchnius. Jewish history goes on, and the Jews have reached very low points. Low points in terms of their physical existence. Low points in terms of their spiritual level. Those boards forever teach us that we have the strength in us, and we have to utilize that strength, never to despair, and to believe in who we are and what we're supposed to do. He says, because the entire message of the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash is Hischazkus. That is all, if you want to call it an advertisement from Shamayim, to be strong. Leida Hashem Yisbach Rotze Ba'amu Yisrael Bo Lishkon Kavod B'Socham. Hashem wants us, and He wants to be with us. Okay, V'shachanti B'Socham. What's brought is that Hashem wants to dwell with us, even with each and every one of us. And therefore, what we needed were these arozim that were described as standing with no limit. Wherever they are, they stand, showing us that the Mishkan and the Mikdash is a davar kasha. It's something strong and solid. V'yesh lo kiyum. It is there. It is always there. It's always standing, even when you can't see it. And the Erez can have all those winds blowing at it and not moving it. This was given to Am Yisrael, and it exists to this day. So therefore, he said, that's the idea of omdim la'olam u'la'omei olamim. That's what stands. When we think about the Mishkan, and the fact that the Mishkan is in the Torah, Hashem knows past, present, and future. He knows that the Mishkan would be destroyed. The Beis HaMikdash would be destroyed. The Mishkan was put away, so to speak. And yet, He gives this to us to read every year. It's part of our Torah. It's part of our mitzvahs. Because what it represents and what it does is ongoing forever. The fact that the Torah is eternal, and the fact that this is in there tells us that that relationship is eternal, and we have to constantly be strengthening ourselves in it. And there's a source of transmission, so to speak, of that strength, which is the Atzei Shitim Omdim. So that's a beautiful idea. I liked it. It was kind of a short Shem MiShmuel. And then I started thinking, okay, now what? it's got to lead to more things. It's got to build on more things. And once again, something happened that I attribute really to the schus, the merit of the holy people in the shir, here or wherever they're listening to. I'd mentioned that sometimes when I need something, HaKadosh Baruch Hu just kind of has me open a sefer. So here's what happened this week. I was invited to go on the first day of Rosh Chodesh to a special minyan that was supposed to happen someplace with a special Rav who was visiting from America. It was going to be very early. I fought the Yetzer Hara. I set my alarm early. I was going to go. I actually got up and then I got a message. Sorry, the Rav is actually davening someplace else. Didn't know that at the time. Sorry, etc. Okay. Meanwhile, I was up. I had to teach in the Beit Vegan neighborhood later on in the morning. So I drove in, and once my original plan goes, I kind of lose it a bit. So I'm like deciding, okay, where should I daven Shachris? I want to miss the traffic jams. I want to get into town. Should I daven in this shul? Should I daven in that shul? I'll daven in this one. There was no parking there. It was pouring rain. I go around. I ended up in the Sachachov Beis Medrash in Beit Vegan, which interestingly, just as we learn every week, Shem MiShmuel, he was the Sachachov Rebbe. The current Rebbe who lives in Beit Vegan is a great-grandson of his. So I was there. When I walked in, I saw an old friend of mine from America who happened to be here and was about to call me, he said, because he wanted me to hand-deliver a letter to somebody. So that was already one nice thing of Hashgacha, which was there. But then, as I often do when I walk into a shul, my eyes start going over the bookshelves. Try and see what's out there, what's new, what haven't I seen before. It's an addiction, but a good one, right, which is out there. And usually my eyes are drawn to the new shiny bindings because that means there's something new out on the market. And I saw a couple nice new things. But suddenly my eye saw a dusty, battered sefer. It was held together with masking tape or kind of black library tape, but that was already kind of cracking and falling off. And in magic marker, written on the binding, it said, Oh leYaakov Husyatin. Okay, now I'd never heard of the sefer. The name Husyatin I had heard of because I have a biography of the famous Husyatin Rebbe. I think it's actually pronounced Hushatin, even though it's written Husyatin. It's kind of like in Massachusetts we had Worcester, and Israelis will say, do you know my cousins, they live in Worcester? I said, no, it's called Worcester. They say, no, it's spelled, I say, you say Worcester. Anyway, so it's Hushatin. And I picked it up, and I opened it up, and I said, let's see what he has on Parshas Terma. And I found something fascinating. Okay, this was by the third Rebbe in the Hushatin dynasty. He was the son-in-law of Rabbi Yisrael of Hushatin, who came to Israel pre-World War II. He was the son of Rabbi Yitzchak of Buhush, who was also a Rebbe who came to Eretz Yisrael. Both of them were descendants of what's called the Rishon dynasty. They came to Israel from Vienna. And he lived in Tel Aviv. So here, the title on his piece for Parshas Teruma gives the year, Tafshin Ches. Tafshin Ches, 1948, War of Independence. This was when he wrote this, and it fascinated me because it was happening real time, and he was connecting the parsha to what was going on. So I'm going to read parts of it inside so that we can go back there to the Tel Aviv of yesterday and see what's happening. He brings the Gemara we just quoted, Atzei Shitim Omdim, right? That you have these boards, and you might think that their hope is lost, that which we look forward to, right, is never going to happen. It tells us, Atzei Shitim Omdim La'olam Ula'omei Olamim. He asks some very provocative questions. He says, why are we looking forward and hoping to the return of these boards? He said they were sidelined long before that, meaning after the Mishkan, already when they set up the Kelim in Shiloh, it was in a Beis Avonim. It was a stone building. They no longer used those boards. The Beis HaMikdash was an entirely different building. Those boards were not used to the Beis HaMikdash. Not for the first one, not for the second one. And the third one, which is described in Yechezkel, the measurements wouldn't even match those boards, aside from the fact that Chazal say that the third Beis HaMikdash is going to come down in a supernatural way. Parenthetically, years ago, and again, you got to take it with a grain of salt, because when I say years ago, we're going like 40 years back here. I heard from Rav Nevensel Shlita, the Rav of the Old City. We had a shir in Rambam, and the Rambam has a whole section which is called Hilchos Beis HaBechira, the laws of how you build the Beis HaMikdash. So he says, the fact that the Rambam wrote that means that even though Chazal talk about it coming down from heaven, nonetheless, if we had the ability to do so, we would have to start building it. That's our mitzvah, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu can continue or respond as he would. Okay, so he said it's strange. We're saying, you might think that those boards are never going to return, but even when they were there, they weren't using them. He says, what are we talking about? So he says, this is why we need those boards to be staying forever. The Orach Chaim HaKadosh says that the word for boards in Hebrew, krashim, kuf, reish, shin, yud, mem, the reish and shin can be switched, kesharim, kesher. A keresh is a board, a kesher is a knot. A kesher is a connection. He says there's a unique kesher between Am Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This goes back to the very beginning of the creation, even before the creation. Yisrael kodmu b'machshava lebriyas ha'olam. Okay, and he says, this is the secret of the knot, the kesher of the tefillin, that it says Hashem showed to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu asked HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Areini nos kvodecha, show me your kavod. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, V'ra'isas achorai, you can see me from behind. Chazal said, what did he show him? The kesher, the knot of the tefillin shorosh. Okay, now I realize this is getting into a very strange world, right, of what seems to be anthropomorphism, right? I like that word. Okay, but this is a Gemara where Chazal said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wears tefillin. Okay, what is contained in his tefillin? It says, Mi ka'amcha Yisrael goyachad ba'aretz. Who is like your nation, Am Yisrael, one nation in the world? Okay, this is also what we refer to, if some people have been in shuls where they say anim zmiros. Kesher tefillin her'ala anav, the knot of the tefillin he showed to the anav, which is Moshe Rabbeinu, the humble one. Tmunas Hashem neged einav. And we say pe'ero alai u'pe'eri alav. Pe'er is a code word for tefillin. His pe'er is on me and mine is on him. What do our tefillin say? Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. What do Hashem's tefillin say? Mi ka'am Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz. The kesher, the knot, represents that connection, that love that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has for us that's unshakable. And our kesher, our knot, expresses it from our direction. Okay? The Mishkan was created, he said, to strengthen that kesher. It was built of krashim, which the Orach Chaim tells us are ksharim. Now, this connection between Am Yisrael and Hashem is sometimes more revealed and sometimes more hidden. Chazal say that the pasuk in Dvarim V'ro kol amei haaretz, the nations of the world will see kishem Hashem nikra alecha v'yaru mimeka. There are times in which the relationship is so strong that the nations of the world will see a Jew, and Chazal interpret this actually, a Jew with the tefillin shorosh, and they stand in awe of that person. But he said, in times of the Golus, the connection gets hidden in both directions. It's hard to see sometime that strong connection and his unshakable love for us when we're going through so much persecution. It's hard to see our unshakable love for HaKadosh Baruch Hu sometimes when we stray. But nonetheless, it's there. This is what Rashi is telling us. He said, you might think the message of the boards, the krashim, the ksharim, is lost its hope, that it won't return, that we won't be able to see it. He says, no. Omdim, right? They stand. Kayomim haksharim lo'olamei olamim. They exist forever. Now here is the beautiful twist he has on it. Omdim means an ongoing present tense. It's not ya'amdu. It's not that it will someday return. It means that it's here now, no matter what's going on. He says, but it appears bilavushim shonim. It's clothed in different ways. You got to know how to see it in order to spot it in the times in which it's not blatantly out there. When the Beis Hamikdash is built, when it's there are ways of seeing it tangibly. Here you have to know to see how it appears, and here's an example he brings. This is where he gets into the history. He says, in the past weeks, we're in a very difficult situation, similar to the one that the Jews were in when Paro was chasing after them and caught them by the sea. On one side you had the ocean. On the other side you had the Egyptians. He said, Rashi and Shir Hashirim said there was a third side, and that had wild animals. So they were really stuck. He says, if Jews in such a situation, meaning the situation here in Israel in 1948, okay, and it's very hard for us to imagine, right, how dangerous that was. The predictions were that the little settlement here, who were unarmed and literally fought with things like seltzer bottles, okay, that was what they used. They didn't have anything to drop from the couple planes they had. They discovered that if you drop those big glass siphon seltzer bottles, they make a sound kind of like a bomb coming down. That's what they used. They didn't have any bombs to drop from the planes. Okay, so the predictions were not good. And he's writing before the end of the war. He's writing while it's still looking dangerous. And he says, Yudim oskim b'Torah of mitzvahs. There are Jews here doing Torah and mitzvahs. Mashkimim u'marivim b'batei midrashos. Going to shul morning and evening. Manichim yisodos l'batei knesset. They are actually putting down foundations for shuls. The Ponevezh Rav started the Ponevezh Yeshiva during, right, the war. People said, this is insane. He said, no, this is specifically when you got to start. Okay, he says they gather on Shabbos to have shalashudas and speak divrei Torah, and they sing Yismechu b'malchuscha. And he says young people are fighting with Mesiras Nefesh to keep the future of our people. They fulfill the pasuk Dom la Hashem v'yischolelo, meaning, right, Chazal said in Zvachim, Afal pi shemapil lecha chalolim, even though there'll be casualties, right, nonetheless, have hope towards Hashem. Continue on. He says this all comes from the kasharim, krushim that are there forever. He says those are, you have to have a discerning eye. The krushim, we say, they're hidden away and they're standing. Yeah, so great, I can't see them. What good does it do for me that they're standing? They appear if you know where to look for them. You see a bunch of Jews in Tel Aviv in 1948 getting together for shalashudas. He says those are the krushim that stand forever and ever. He brings another example. He says, I read an account in a newspaper, a 17-year-old boy who was fighting all night on the borders of Tel Aviv. Mind-blowing, right? That's where the border was. To think that the war was actually there, okay, at Tel Aviv. In the morning, exhausted, he walked into one of the yeshivas in Tel Aviv to listen to a Gemara shir. A young man from Kfar Hoeh, he said. When I heard this, he said, I realized the power that we have. He said, not only, right? He said, we have two enemies. He said, an external enemy and an internal enemy. Our external enemy now, he says, are the Arab armies that are trying to destroy us. The internal enemy is the Yetzer Hara, who's trying to weaken our emunah, trying to weaken our bitachon. With his questions, he says, after everything that we went through in the past war, after all the destruction, you come to Israel to get attacked and bombed and shot? He says, against those two enemies, we see that people are fighting, right? They go to yeshiva to fight against the internal one. They go to the front to fight against the external one. And he says, even those young people that don't have the connection to Torah, because they've been influenced by foreign cultures, and they're far from Torah, they're fighting with Mesiras Nefesh for the Jewish people. He says that's also coming from that kesher. It's also coming from the boards of the Mishkan. They themselves may not realize it. How are they so strong? Why are they so strong? That's where it's coming from. He says, and therefore, don't despair of them. Right? In other words, the same despair that Rashi describes. If the boards of the Mishkan were hidden, will we ever see them? Will they ever fulfill the hope that we have for them? In the same way, you can look at a Jewish young person and think what's going to be. They're so far, they're so distant. He says you have to know that inside of them is a kesher, which is omed le'olam le'olmei olamim. It's always standing. And he says, but with the power of that, yoshuvu sof sof b'tshuva shlema. He says they'll return. He brings a fascinating Gemara in Eruvin. He says, Dari Mari Bar Mar, he says, Es shnei dudoi hate'enim asher ra Yirmiyahu b'mara hanavua. Yirmiyahu, in Perikov Dalet, had a vision of two duda'ei te'enim, they were called, figs. Some of them were good, and some of them were not very good. The good ones represent tzaddikim. The bad figs represent those who had left the path of tzidkus. Once again, the Gemara says there, the same thing it said about the boards of the Mishkan. Those figs, Shema Tomar Avad Sivram Ubatel Sikuyam, he says, are those figs just going to rot? Is nothing going to come of them? He quotes Shir Hashirim, Hadudaim Nasnu Reach. It talks there also about Dudaim, plural, will give a beautiful smell. Eilu ve'elu asidim liten reach tov. Both groups of figs, those nice, fresh, plump, good ones, those ones that are scrawny or not so good, not so nice, all of them in the future would do it. He says we find that same phrase in Chazal for two promises. One, the promise of the boards of the Mishkan. Two, these figs that represent two different types of Jews. He says, nonetheless, those will return, and you can see, if you look properly, you can see the evidence of that connection even today, even in the ones who are far away. So he says, therefore, he says, I have confidence that these things will be fulfilled, right? And that we'll have the strength to fulfill that hope that's there. In the merit of the kesher, the keresh, which is there, in the merit of the fact that it stands, and that Am Yisrael have in themselves this ability of something that does stand, that does go on, and doesn't give up. And it's expressed in different ways by different people. But he says, if you know to see it, you can see those boards, even today. You can see them with your eyes. You just have to know how to look. I wanted to finish with a story about the Belzer Rebbe, or Baron of Belz, who made it through the claws of the Nazis. They had a manhunt out for him. It's fascinating that the Nazis understood sometimes more than what Jews understand. They went on a manhunt for well-known Rabbonim, especially Hasidic Rebbes. They called them Wunder Rabbiner, wonder rabbis. And they said that they must be stopped because if they can escape, they have the power to rebuild the Jewish people. It was a fascinating thing. So he managed to escape, came to Eretz Yisrael. He had lost so much, right, back in Europe. He was a person who was almost a malach during those years that he was here in Eretz Yisrael. He barely ate, he barely slept. He was involved in constant avoda. People near him could tell that he was fighting for us in the spiritual spheres, doing all sorts of things. And he had a tremendous midah, tremendous attribute of seeing the good in Am Yisrael and never wanting to hear anything negative about Am Yisrael, never wanting to hear anything negative about Jews. So the Tolner Rebbe, who grew up in Bayit Vegan here in Yerushalayim, the same neighborhood where I found that sefer, he says that he heard the following story from a man in Bayit Vegan who had the schus that in the summer, Reb Baron of Belz came and stayed in his house. Okay, before the world of air conditioners, people who lived in Tel Aviv, in that area, used to always try to plan a Yerushalayim summer vacation to come to the cool air of Yerushalayim. So he said, one day, while the Belzer Rebbe was staying at his house in Bayit Vegan, he saw a child who had long payas coming down the side of his head. It wasn't very common in those days in general, and certainly in Bayit Vegan, he said it was not common at all. And the Rebbe drew him close, and he said, after everything we went through in that war, to be able to see a Jewish child with simonim, it's interesting, that's what the Yemenites call payas, simonim, right? A sign, an external sign of that Jewishness. He said he had so much emotion And if we think of those pictures of Nazis cutting off the payas and beards of Jews, he had such emotion when he saw this. A bit later, he told his gabbai, he said, please bring me water to wash my hands. Now, when you read the biographies of Baron of Belz, a lot of his avodah was always preceded by Netilas Yadayim. He did Netilas Yadayim multiple times throughout the day. He washed his hands, and he says, I have to fix something that I did. I did something wrong. I said something very wrong. He says, only because of the war and this child has payas, did I say that he's a special Jewish child? He said in Yiddish, alle Yiddische Kinder sind gut. All Jewish children are good. And he felt very bad about this. He says, it was wrong. I should not have singled out that one child as if he's something special. Everyone's special, all. And he took his shamas and he said, you have to say with me 3 times, alle Yiddische Kinder sind gut. All Jewish children are good. This is something that we have to remind ourselves always. This is the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks at us, with that unbroken knot that's there that we have to strengthen ourselves. And to know that deep inside, sometimes it's very hidden, that's also inside every Jew. And the people with the discerning eye can look around and see the Atzei Shitim Omdim, the boards of the Mishkan, standing proud among us all around. The hope is there, the vision is there, and they will yet fulfill their promise. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Thank you all for coming. And thank you to Kilat Chaverim for hosting us once again.